baby, it's been a long, long while. We're both a whole lot older and seen a lot of miles. But things are really different now since the good old days. And you've been in some trouble since we went our separate ways. We'll have to say hello maybe some other time instead, 'cause you're wanted by the police and my wife thinks you're dead.
So funny. You're wanted by the police and my wife thinks you're dead. Get away from me.
You had lost your life.
In this half hour, we are talking to the criminally funny J6er, a man who spent 3 years in the gulag/jail/prison for simply attending the January 6th speech of President Trump at the Ellipse and going to the Capitol. Here he is, that you insurrectionist, Tim Hale. How are you, man?
I'll let you know when I'm done with my next insurrecting. Yeah, I'm working on it. Hey, thank you for having me back on. It's a blessing to be back. What?
Well, it's always good to remind people what has been happening to American citizens, strictly for expressing their political opinions in this country, and it is still going on, is it not, Tim?
Yes, actually, unfortunately, it is still going on, and they're bragging about it. They're still arresting people.
Yeah, the FBI is still, they've still got bulletins out for specific individuals who were at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, not breaking the law in many cases. Oh, and the latest statements from the FBI saying that any hint or allegation that there were FBI agents as a part of the so-called insurrection or egging people on is absurd and unfounded. They're still sticking to their story.
Yeah, well, that's real interesting. It makes you wonder why they can't answer questions during congressional hearings. Hey, how many informants did you have on the grounds? I can't answer that. I can't answer that. Yeah, not the most consistent people, the feds. Can't call them that. Never accuse them of that.
So what's interesting about your story is that you were in jail for a time with actual informants that were sent to the Capitol on January 6th strictly to rat people out who were there. Is that correct?
Yeah, and not just that, but, it's just funny because, when you actually get to watch it, they have camera crews there. They bring their own cameras. They film their own little mini insurrection documentaries. It's all just fake. But, yeah, that's about that's the long and short of it, yeah. It was a huge setup.
Tim Hale, and to that point, to that end, how many people are in prison right now? Do you know of? And under this bogus misinterpretation of what is it, 1512C or whatever? How many people are still incarcerated to this point? You got out. How did you get out?
I ended up getting out. In part thanks to President Trump signing the First Step Act. So I actually, instead of doing the full 4-year sentence, I only had to do 3 years. But unfortunately, that doesn't apply to everybody. So I didn't have violent charges. So, that shaved a lot of my time off. But I still had to do 3 years. And I'd say there's probably there's a couple hundred people who are still, rotting in jails and prisons throughout the country. It actually... I don't want to embellish, but it really does remind me of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. The idea that, prisons and jails are just scattered throughout the country and they form their own little archipelago of these prison islands. And that's really what it is. They're out of sight, out of mind. And this is ignoring that they've charged over 1,400 people and they're still trying to get more. So there's at least a couple hundred who are actually still rotting.
Here's the other question, and you just said you got out in 3 years because yours was a non-violent offense. What were you exactly charged with, Tim Hale?
Well, like you actually just referenced, yeah, I was a I was a victim of the 18 USC 1512 obstruction of an official proceeding. Sounds scary. What it basically is, it's the actual statute is called tampering with a witness. It goes back to the 80s.
To the Enron thing.
Well, see, that's the crazy thing. That didn't even get added. And like you said, Enron, that was 2003. So that's a subsection they just added in there. So that's what the obstruction of an official proceeding thing is. They, and it had to do with destroying documents. So the reason they were able to apply it to J6 defendants is because their theory, which is ridiculous, is that by interrupting the certification of Congress, that had to do with tampering with their quasi-judicial powers of oversight or inquiry, which is completely wrong. And the Supreme Court, we're expecting the court to toss it out in a couple weeks. But that's not much of a consolation for someone like me who already served their sentence. It'd be nice if I didn't have to serve 3 years behind bars for a fake crime. But hopefully, no one else is going to be hit with this.
Well, and it is particularly important for President Trump and the case in Washington, D.C., which he is charged, I guess, with the same thing, is he not?
Yeah, absolutely.
In that particular case?
Absolutely. And, we talked about the informants just to, bring this full circle. I've mentioned this before. The first January 6th defendants to have 1512 upheld in federal court were those informants that I mentioned who went there with a camera, as a camera crew. Nathan Grave, Ronald Sandlin. These informants were the first guys to have the federal courts uphold 1512 for January 6th. And so federal informants were the first guys to have this charge upheld, and it's not just being used against J6ers, but against President Trump. I think they planned this years in advance, not just to sabotage 2020, but expecting him to run again in 2024. That's my expectation. That's my belief.
Well, and it is telling now that there has been tape released of Nancy Pelosi accepting responsibility and saying it was my fault that the National Guard weren't there, which it was. I mean, President Trump, people denied that President Trump offered up to 10,000 National Guardsmen on that day to protect the Capitol when he did, and he contacted the Nancy Pelosi Sergeant-at-Arms and security and said, listen, I have a feeling this is going to be bigger than Capitol Police or anybody can handle. I have these National Guardsmen at your disposal, and both Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, the leaders of the House and the Senate at the time, both refused those National Guardmen that President Trump offered in the first place.
Yes, sir.
I mean, if it's not a setup, then why did they refuse the protection to keep people from so-called breaching the Capitol? They wanted it to happen.
Absolutely. And, you used the word setup. So did the Metro PD. We have their body cameras, and there are Metro PD officers yelling, they set us up, they set us up. Well, who's they? And I always make this observation. The Metro Police answered to Mayor Bowser, and the Capitol Police answered to Nancy Pelosi at the time. So who set them up? You just made the point. Trump offered support. So who really set them up? It was the swamp. And to really, I brought it full circle before. I'm going to bring it full oval. Can you handle that? We're going to bring it full oval. Nancy Pelosi's daughter was filming a documentary for January 6th. Well, what's interesting? Those same guys I just mentioned, especially Ronald Sandlin, were in contact with Pelosi's daughter, trying to get involved with their documentary and filming footage. There's so many connections the average person has no idea about, and it's all performative. This is all kabuki theater.
I love the fact that you were always willing to talk about this, Tim, and if you are willing to hang on through this break, we will talk about it some more. Is that okay?
My time is your time, my liege.
The criminally funny J6er Tim Hale is our guest in this half hour. What's been done to this country and what's continuing to be done to American citizens strictly on the basis of their political leanings is criminal in and of itself. We will continue the conversation in moments here on 55 KRC, the talk station. What is going on in this country? What used to be a constitutional republic has become a banana republic. Evidence of that on my phone line right now. The criminally funny J6er Tim Hale is back with us to talk a little bit about his experience in the gulags and in the prisons of January 6th, 2021. Tim, you have turned this. But first and foremost, I love your X post of can't wait to rejoin Gary Jeff Walker. I just want to let you know, full disclosure, that picture was taken in 2008. I look nothing like that now. I've lost teeth and my hair is gray. So just so you know, for your further, I'll have to send you a new photo. So you have you've done a lot of work. Now, is Ed Martin still helping you guys out from the Freedom Project?
Yes, he is. Yeah, he's actually he's very active, and he's actually he's done a lot of research himself with finding interesting actors in the crowd.
What do we know about this Capitol cop who was lauded for his heroic actions on January 6th, the one who murdered Ashley Babbitt, who was an unarmed Air Force veteran who happened to be inside the Capitol that day? Do we know anything more about him, and if he will ever suffer the proper repercussions for murdering someone who was unarmed and not doing anything?
Well, first let me say, I feel your pain. I know exactly what it's like to have out of context old pictures used against you. So we'll take care of that. We will take care of that in the future. Don't worry. And my teeth rotted a little in the gulag too. So I still feel your pain. Unfortunately, what happened with Babbitt was a travesty, and it was totally uncalled for. This 90-pound woman, Officer Byrd, the real travesty is that, and of course, those of us who believe in law and order and all that, obviously, we always want to, whenever there's an incident that they try to hype up so they can cause riots throughout the country, we always take the position, let's wait and let's hear what the full story is. But what's interesting with this is that they refused to give out his name at first. They wouldn't do a real investigation. They just kind of hand waved it. And then eventually the guy, Officer Byrd, he goes on, I think it was 60 Minutes. He starts doing interviews bragging about doing it. And that's the real punch in the gut, is that there was no sense of real remorse at all. It was just kind of you brought it upon yourselves. I mean, this was a woman who was already surrounded by police officers. Obviously, they didn't feel threatened, or they would have stopped her. Unfortunately, maybe when President Trump gets back into office, he'll be held accountable. I frankly, there's no statute of limitations on murder, but in the foreseeable future, I just don't foresee anything coming of this. There was a lot of, and again, it was a very complicated day. It was very messy, but I don't think anybody's really been held accountable for what happened on January 6th in terms of the people acting in an official capacity. So, we just talked about Nancy Pelosi. It took 3 years just for video to really make an impact where she's blatantly saying she's responsible. And nothing's going to happen to her. She's not going to be held responsible. And she's maybe not at the top of the food chain, but she's certainly higher up than Officer Byrd. So, if she's not going to be held accountable, I just don't see it. I don't see it. I think that they're just going to keep obfuscating.
Tim Hale, let me ask you about this. What about the videos that first Tucker Carlson made public, and those were just the tip of the iceberg of the videos of that day inside the Capitol?
Sure.
The video of the shaman and the video of other people being escorted in and around the Capitol by security and police, and how are they threatening those people? If they're actually being escorted around the building by police officers or by security in the Capitol.
Right. It's such an interesting dichotomy between what is portrayed versus what actually is, especially once you actually just get to sit down, without all the noise from the media and just actually look at it yourself. People could ask questions if they want about going there dressed like a buffalo, but like, okay, it wouldn't be my first choice. I chose a suit and tie. That's cool though. But I like buffaloes. We all like buffaloes. We love the buffaloes, don't we, folks? But the thing is, like, he really got screwed because he had a flagpole, and they tried to argue that it was a dangerous weapon because there was like there's some sort of blade at the top of the flag, but he never brandished it like a weapon. And so, I mean, that's really the best case you could possibly make against the guy. It didn't mean he deserved 4 years in prison. He basically. So, I mean, yeah, unfortunately, it's like a lot of people got that same treatment. And in his case, they tried to make him, a few others, they tried to make us like the face of all this for narrative purposes. But really, as clear as day, it's almost like a photo op. He goes into the what's called the Ohio Clock Corridor, and they want to focus on certain parts of him being wherever. But what's interesting is if you watch the CCTV footage, not only are there cops leading him around, there's like 11 photographers who come out of nowhere to take pictures of him standing next to the cops to make it seem like there's this big standoff. And then some dude walks up with a little fire extinguisher. He shoots some gas in the air, and the cops all run away like they're getting shot at. It's like the most insane thing ever. It's just none of this is real. It's like really looking back on it, like, this is nuts. They tried to make it seem like this was the Boxer Rebellion or something like that, and really it's just a bunch of people walking around a building in a buffalo costume. I mean, what are we actually talking about?
You went to the ellipse to watch President Trump's speech. And then afterwards, you went to the Capitol grounds. You were never inside the Capitol, were you, Tim?
I actually was, but the thing is, I was, and this is the interesting thing. Whatever violence happened at the Capitol, most of it actually happened outside the building. When you actually look at the video, people inside the Capitol building wandered around like it was a museum. And so when I actually walked in there, the doors were already open. So, whatever you want to think about the first people who broke the windows or whatever, the doors were already open. So people just poured in there. And so, like, I'm on CCTV, I'm literally dancing like a nerd inside what's called the Capitol Visitor Center. Like, I'm just like being a nerd. I was in a portion called the Crypt. The Crypt is great. Like, it's beautiful. There's all these statues and stuff like that. But again, I'm an internet troll, so I noticed somebody put a Trump flag in the hand of a statue. I'm like, oh man, I got to get it. So I posed for a picture with this statue. I mean, that's really what it was. It was just people goofing off and whatever. Perfectly frank, I didn't even know where I was. I was wandering around following other people, and I'm sure you've seen the video. I think Tucker might have played this, but if not, it's all out there. You have like 80-year-old ladies wandering through like velvet ropes. They're walking in an orderly line on the second floor of the building. People made it to the second floor, and they're walking through velvet ropes. They're in an orderly fashion. I mean, like, that's not an insurrection. That's not even a riot at that point. That's just people wandering around in the people's house.
It's a tour. It's a tour.
Yeah,
it's an unguided tour of the Capitol, is what it is. Tim.
It's a guided tour. In the case of the shaman dude, it's an actual guided tour.
A guided tour.
Yes.
I guess the crime was he didn't pay.
Yeah, he didn't schedule with the visitor center first. That was the Capitol Police.
Funny.
The Capitol Police were working off the books. They were getting paid under the table. That's what it was.
What do you say real quickly in our last minute? What do you say to people who say this was worse than the Civil War? This was terrible. This was worse than 9/11. All of the other comparisons they make that are utterly ridiculous. What do you tell these people?
I mean, it's the worst kind of pearl clutching, because even ignoring the partisan aspect of it, like, I'm a history major, so like up to 800,000 Americans died in the Civil War. Like 3,000 people died on 9/11, and the only people who died on January 6th were actually protesters. And they tried to say at the beginning one officer died, Officer Sicknick. He was killed, but it turned out the autopsy showed he died of natural causes the next day. So, I mean, this was like a really gross example of what we would call atrocity propaganda. And it really, not to sound out there, but this is just further proof to me that this narrative was built as some sort of false flag or a color revolution sort of thing, really just to cover up the other crime, which was the election. So, I mean, I can't take anybody 3 years later. If you still buy that nonsense, it's really your fault,
I agree. They can find you on Twitter or X and elsewhere, correct?
Yep, as you've alluded to, and I love that it's sticking now. You can find me on X at Tim Hale, criminally funny J6er. I just want to say thank you so much for having me back on. It's always a pleasure. Death to political correctness. Don't let your memes be dreams. Free the J6ers. Trump 2024. That's my pitch.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Tim Hale, everybody.